Where do I get to? Yeah, so the idea of scoliosis. Often this is kind of dismissed as scoliosis. There's a big difference in the spine having a big kind of curve in it to it just being adapted and compressed. For many, not all, for many, it's invariably, we've just going back to really the guys in Lucy's observation as well around the age group. So what Lucy said there is so true. As you move through life, you become more plastic and less elastic. So hopefully the guys will see this trip at 14, to what age are they used? 14 to 17?
Yeah.
Are much more elastic humans because they haven't adapted so much yet. And a lot of the guys we saw last time are becoming more plastic, more fixed. Invariably, they've just been held in this position for a long time. So the ribs have done this rather than the spine doing that. So often when you see these kind of adaptations that way, it can be scoliosis, but more often it's more they're just compressed because of years being in this position. That's a big difference. And I got asked this question in a presentation I gave last week, and again, whoever was in the audience unfortunately misunderstood what I said, so that's probably a mistake of mine. And I got some pretty unpleasant comments sent to me, but it's like, okay, that's just probably where those guys are at. Someone asked me about doing squats and deadlifts. I said, like, it's a great value, squatting and deadlift. Of course it is, when it's relevant. And like any intervention, it's very much related to what problem are you attempting to resolve. And again, that's been lost in training. Whatever training you do is around what problem, what are you actually attempting to resolve by moving and training that way. When you have someone who's lived in that position for a long period of time, into these kind of big squat positions, for me, is perhaps maybe not the best approach of resolving that. Until we decompress them and put them back somewhere in a nice position again, what value is there to put in more load and compressing them further? And someone took that as me saying squats are bad. Absolutely not anyway. Anyway. My question is, you don't start exploring training approaches until you fully understand what is it you're actually trying to resolve. So everything is good, everything's of value at the right time and place. Just putting 100 kilos on someone's back when they live in that position, think about it. So one of the things we can all do more of is hang. And I know something Lucy and I spoke about a lot, again with the guys back in July, just trees and bar. I'm always finding that it's almost my first thing when I arrive somewhere, where's my nearest bar or tree, just to hang off again. Because hanging will decompress us. So one of the things we can all do, especially around the age group Lucy and I have spent time around lately, is to hang more. Doesn't mean you shouldn't squat or deadlift. If that is designed to answer that question you are attempting to solve. So hopefully that's I got some pretty unpleasant comments. You said deadlift's bad, I've never said that. But that's just how that person unfortunately, to probably challenge their own beliefs, that whatever. Anyway. So one thing we'll look at in a minute is the idea of compressed right side. It was a real dominant thread last month. I think that many of the guys came in that shape. And again, we can do some things like hanging in a foam way later on. Another huge observation from last month. I'm trying to find a way so you can all see something. It was really how so much connected back to that control through that trail shoulder. So thankfully, only because it used to. We have any left-handed people last time? Was it one?
We had one.
One, yeah. So we'll call it right shoulder just for ease of audience, but obviously invert this for left-handed plate ball. How really, and it all connects in then. There's this thread that will hopefully develop through the morning today. How reduced control they had through that right shoulder. Lots of kind of, real. We had a very nice case that we actually got on videos. It was quite evident how poor they were through that right shoulder. However, when they live in this very compressed position, it will then really change how that shoulder joint moves. And we did some pretty kind of playful observations with the guys last time. We got them to be very kind of squashed through here, and they can't, but we got them to open up through here. Oh, I can move loads now. So even when you look at these measurements used, it very much comes back to what position you actually make that movement from. Everybody stand up actually. And purposely, really kind of squash down and push the shoulder forwards. Put your arm in this position and then just see how much it wants to rotate out. Then kind of really take a real big breath into that right side, shoulder back a bit more, nice and low, then rotate. I'm hoping most of you find that you get more range. A bit more. A bit more, yeah. Thank you, by the way. So a lot of this stuff is dependent on what position you tested from. So it was so evident last time that when you had these people in these very jammed up positions because of life and mobile phones and all the usual kind of stuff, now one that they test like they actually lack range and lack movement through that trail arm, just really connects back to where you tested from. So I want to show some examples of kind of how it can look, what real good at anatomical movement is, and then when we start looking at this afternoon, and with some of the case studies, how well we observed this with some of the guys last month. The other one which was really evident last time was the reduced control and movement around that lead hip in particular. So is this for you left-handed? So for you it will be this one. Thank you. So again, really how, I don't want to say poor, because poor is a poor word, but we'll call it poor because it's easy today. Really how poor they were through that lead hip. How much adjustment, but just to kind of skip forward slightly, why that trail, shoulder, lead, hip, those kind of connections are so important. Still one of the best examples I've seen of a player, and anatomically, again, it goes back to the spiral, the helix. We are, in essence, one kind of big cross. The cross is a symbol of many things in life, isn't it? And the skull and crossbones, religious symbols, the unknown number, a stop sign. The cross is a kind of a universal sign to describe most things in human life, if you think about it. But it's also, the human body is just one continuous series of crosses, spirals. One being how you can hopefully see this wonderful defined, we'll call it muscle because it's easy, cross in this great example, one of the best I've ever seen, of how those tissues, they form those big X's on this human's back. This is very impressive, by the way. And they go from the opposite shoulder, opposite hip. Is it warm in here, Hank, or is it me? Because it feels like the heating on the way. Are you guys hot? I'm like,
Can you want to open the window
yeah.
a bit? Yeah.
Yeah. Was it me? Mine's getting roasted up here, so apologies, I look a bit distracted, but it's like this hair bra on me, but that's better. We can breathe now. These wonderful X's, crosses that form in our body. One of the more dominant ones, you may know them as slings. That seems to be a popular word being used currently, or the fascias, it's also rightly so called. You can hopefully see it very defined. Can you all see that? This is kind of, you don't see many guys like this. This is me 3 or 4 years ago. Me and my dreams. So often what the left hip does connects into the right shoulder and vice versa is the real reason why I kind of wanted to show you this little video, that we have that connection, that the right shoulder, left hip connect up. So when you start seeing issues through here, it often then influences what we do through here. And also vice versa, but because golf is more that movement, it's a throw-in movement, it's more lean hip, right shoulder connected. And then really how that connects back to some of the forces around the club, which we'll show this morning. So really, certainly what you see, and I saw a lot last month, was really those first 3 areas. Almost, it could have been a group session, hence the players we had this trip would be taking that approach. We're all a bit jammed up here, all really, I say poor, apologies for my language this morning, really poor around that trail, shoulder, lead, hip and movement. It became a real kind of thread that we observed, and in response to that, it really influenced the force of the club, which is why then things like distance, pain, variability, being unreliable, hard to predict becomes an issue. So just to give you some examples of this, I really can't believe how well on time we are this morning, Hank. This is unusual for me, so maybe I can go now. Of how it may display as that kind of compressed trail side. So for this gentleman here, for left-handed people, just swap it over. And hopefully you can all see through things like the kind of the clavicle, the collarbone, get out the way of this gentleman here, the kind of nipple line. I'm going to show another one in a second. How, if you, not that I would ever encourage you to do this, but if you kind of got everyone to take their tops off, and even in this environment this morning, many of us would have this slight kind of, so some very crude ways. This is one of my favourite examples from a few years ago, what I saw. This is how this young lad saw the planet. Very good player actually, this kid. And it kind of goes back to this lady's question earlier on that they kind of grow in those positions because of golf and adolescence and puberty and what have you. How he kind of saw the world like this. I hope you can all see. Can you see? Okay, I'm slightly kind of blocked. I'm trying to get away. That's how most of the players, unfortunately, look. And going back to what UC and I saw, were displaying last time. Predictors. That's all they are. So it allows you when you're at the club to go, okay, I think there may be something which we need to look at on a bigger level. Does everybody stand up for me? Almost in pairs if you can, in twos. And just please don't cheat. Just kind of, it's a bit of fun. It's not. This isn't going to make the next kind of Journal of Science. Just kind of look at your partner and look at their right foot relative to their left. They often look a lot like this. Thank you, by the way. No, you're great. By doing nothing, you were brilliant. And look at which arm hangs lower. Does their right arm hang low and forwards? Does their right foot kind of point out more than their left? This gentleman put him, that right foot's kind of out compared to the left. Backing out. Look at the right foot. Look at the right foot. Is it backing out compared to the left?
Niin mulla.
Joo. Equal duck position.
I'm bad. Don't worry.
Et sä ainakaan tyyliin. Et sä lyönyt Eikä kyllä hirveästi näe mitään. Jalat auki, sopiva. Toi vähän auki.
Sulla on toi oikeus suoraan vasen.
Niin vasen auki.
Joo. Vasen auki.
Okay. Do many of us see two very evident things? How that right foot kind of sits backing out, and how we're a little bit, which is quite, quite common in many players. That's a pretty good representation. You look like these two individuals on the screen. So to go back to the previous one. So when we get very short and compressed, our response is to kind of do this. So just by look, again, goes back to kind of Hank's question, which is so good this morning. How can you start to see by movement? If you just look at them and go, and kind of give that kind of slightly kind of curious eye, you can normally go, well, just the way they stand through life. And in many ways, it connects back to what we discussed at Via Meraki back in November. I talked about standing, walking, and really throwing. It's a pretty good representation of most things in life. How we stand, how we walk, and kind of how we throw. Yeah, can be three pretty good ones, but certainly watching someone stand, especially when they're not aware you're watching them. So I attempt in every session that I do just to watch people walk when they first come into the range, or if I'm back at my studio in England or wherever it might be, because at that point they're so unaware of what you're doing, and and often when people are slightly kind of not nervous, they behave even more like the way they normally do. And you kind of see them just kind of like this, and so you normally go, well, yeah, that might be a pretty good sign that they're very jammed up to that right side. For those that are more into kind of physiology and anatomy and what have you, even through design, because most of us, not all, there's some examples where that coffee is very strong, by the way, Haynes, so I need to kind of lay off that. It's not a good one.
Special for you, so.
There was an Iceland use, I said, you do decaf, and they looked at me and went, leave our shop. Okay. Most of our organs are on our right side of our body. So our right lung is inherently smaller than our left lung, believe it or not. We're not balanced. So every time we breathe in, we actually breathe into this position. So every in-breath, that wonderful inhalation, because this lung is bigger, we get pushed into these positions. Even through breath, we are designed to kind of get a bit like this. So, you know, how you breathe, this comes into different areas and becomes so important. I know we did some of this with one of the guys last time, but just loads of hanging. And just do lots of big breaths just to help realign you again. So I would hang from anything. It would be just a great approach to this. So that was one of the big things, just in setup, just how everybody was all a bit kind of that way. Yes, sir.
This is a silly question, actually.
It's only one silly question, the one you never asked.
Yeah, I know this actually may lead to pain and loss of power. I just started thinking, are these actually basically making our bodies, or the golfers' bodies, to produce force to the golf club and be able to play better golf? So my question is this actually a good or a bad thing? I know we can look at this for the rest of the day and answer that question, but does this sort of right shoulder lower actually help a player even? As we play from the right side, produces force and control and everything.
It kind of goes back to that, and it's certainly not a stupid question, it's a very relevant one. It goes back to the idea of becoming elastic and plastic. When you're very elastic, it doesn't really matter because you can adapt beautifully well. As we move through those back end of those teenage years, you start to get a bit kind of fixed and a bit plastic. So it's kind of hard to move it then. So for a 12-year-old, probably makes no difference because they're just the most wonderfully, you know, expansive, adaptive movers because they're just so good. We get to the back end of the teens, as this young lady mentioned, we get a bit kind of, it's like when glue starts to set. Look at glue. As it starts to go a bit hard, it's like hard to move now. So as you get more like glue through life, it becomes more problematic. And also, it becomes, having the right shoulder down is absolutely fine, as long as it can still move. Having the right shoulder down and it can't move then becomes a problem. So it really connects back again to what problem are you attempting to resolve? So if the right shoulder is low, absolutely fine. If it can still move well, it becomes an issue and it gets a bit, I can't move it. So that's when you start to say, at what point does it become an issue? What we observed, you see, and I last time was it will become an issue of almost every player. Most guys came back with some kind of taping on their wrist or some kind of issue they've been experiencing whilst at college with pain. They all had very dominant club delivery behaviours now. There was massive issues around impact. So actually if you may be now, it's just gone a bit too much that way. So I kind of take the view, guys, when is too much a bit too much? When is it becoming a bit now unhelpful? So even, and I love that question, even good or bad for me is not a nice way, it's more, does that help or not help, that movement? So I'd more encourage you to see it more as helpful or unhelpful. Good luck defining good or bad. That really is a whole different area. So I would look at it, most of what we saw last month was it's just getting a bit of a problem now. So you're absolutely right. So it's like the foot, it's like people talk about pronated feet. The shape of the foot's not important, it's how well the foot moves. Same with the shoulder really.
Mark,
Yes.
would you think that would influence on how the person would swing the club basically?
Massively, which is what I'll run.
I mean like attack angles and stuff like that. So
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
You start to look at, again, goes back, we saw so many guys last month that were quite shallow into impact, and we're kind of we look at how they were here and how they kind of moved through impact because of that. Which is ironically, these videos I'll show you now are brilliant by the way. Because of that very jammed up kind of rib cage, how they then really found it hard for that shoulder to move well. So then they start to get that real kind of disconnection, poor control, lack of rotation, changes how the club moves. We saw so many guys that are really shallow into impact.
And a follow-up, have you ever seen a person that actually hits from the right and feels like this?
Yeah, I've seen some guys, you get some people that more through birth, so that's when it would be more of a scoliosis, their curvature is that way. Again, that's just a different constraint. You find again a different way of working around that problem. So you get some guys that are born, Usain Bolt was born with a big curve, I'm not sure which way by the way. He was born with scoliosis, he's still pretty quick. He was born that way, so if someone's born that way through life, it'd be interesting how many guys then play right-handed, which is a different conflict, but very different, yeah, so that's when it gets really complex. But normally we just have to go right, slow it down and look at it, but that's when it goes into then expectations of sessions. What we're doing wrong, well just slow down. And I know you and I were talking about this last time, that we all need to go a bit slower and just look at things with more intellect and just breathe. We don't need to give the answer now, but that's often people's expectations of sessions. You have this data, what do I need to do? Well, just drink decaf coffee to start with, and just slow down and we'll look at it. But they all want the answer now because that's the expectation. Fair? Click it and get it. That's golf development these days. What button do I press? So that's then you have to really say, let's explore that really slowly, very precisely to see what approach is best for you.
And in what time period you can think that the guy who stands like that would be standing straight? Basically, is it more of the I just start to stand straight now, or do you have to do something with a gym or trainer or?
Yeah, I mean all of that depends on how long they lived in that position, how dominant that imbalance has become, how plastic they become, their awareness of standing well. So normally, as you'll experience this afternoon, it's pretty instantaneous. So hopefully what we'll go through when we play these drills later today is your guy can really now feel more open in length in that right side. Then it's reminding itself through here then to remain that way through the day. How you sit, how you drive, how you walk. So that's very much down to, like most things in life, it's on not you, it's on you the player to solve this, not me. But we now live in a world where they think it's my problem to solve. No, it's not. You're the one that allowed this to happen, so therefore it's your problem to solve. I will give you the awareness of how to resolve it, but it must be on you, young man, to resolve this. It's their problem to solve, not ours, despite what they think. You've got to get them to own their own problems, not how will Mark solve this for me. Well, Mark's going to solve nothing for you. I'll give you the information and the awareness and the hope for the intellect, but it's on you to do the work. What I know about very, very good players, and the ones that I've been very blessed to be around, is that they own their own development. They don't let other people own the problem. So you look a lot for how people respond. People talk about how can you help me, what you give me. They normally want you to do it for them. No. You have to do it. So it becomes a real big area, and the good ones like doing it. They like to know what they have to do. So a lot of it comes back to, if you stand like that through life, it will take you probably minutes and hours. If you expect someone like me to do it for you, you'll probably live like that for life. So you've got to always put it on them. It's your problem to solve, in a fun way, not in an abrasive way, to resolve this. So I thought about this today, and I thought, let's give you some nice examples now of people that start to move well. To give some really good references around that trail arm initially. So first one being that rib cage, and we're going to, using you guys as examples, we can hopefully all see we stand a bit because of compression, expansion, compression again. That happens to be a lovely target line with that light coming through there on the. How's that for good planning? You've even got the sunlight. Thank you, Helsinki. That was brilliant. It's a nice defined target line there. But I want to go through now some really good examples of the trail shoulder lead hip connection, and then go through some of the case studies that you and I saw last month. So these are anatomical references rather than say golf coaching beliefs or golf coaching values or whatever. That's something very, very different. And that's who am I to say they're wrong. This is just good anatomy, good movement. We know how muscles like to produce force. We know how joints like to really move to produce good movement. These are just very good anatomy references. Now, if someone sees them all differently, absolutely, good for you guys. I'm not here to judge any kind of coaching beliefs. This is just good movement. So I just want to take this guy to the top of batsman and stop. A really good definition of kind of how I would see very, very good. So what golf coaches have historically called I'm very aware of Hank's camera there. Connection is a bit like rotation and distance. They're the kind of deadly duo in some ways of golf coaching. Connection is also another great one. I want to be more connected to what? And this is a great example, and I'll show you another one in a second, of very, very good scapular, shoulder, rib cage connection, which is really what connection is. Connection, for those that are kind of more unfamiliar, would be how well that shoulder blade, the scapula, interacts with the rib cage as it rotates. Poor connection. We had a great example, UC and I, last month, when we start seeing lots of this stuff and lots of that, which is that disconnection. Now, why is that trail shoulder so important? Anatomically, it's almost the link, the connection. We'll call it the body and arms because it's dead easy today. It's almost the connecting link between the body and the arms. Then why that's so important, you go back to the idea of compression, expansion, the spirals, the helixes, the waves of water that we have. For those that are very familiar with ground reaction force, which many of us are these days, force plates, it's hard to escape that information, and it's very valuable for different reasons. Most of those forces you produce through lower limb, it's something called wave propagation for those that are really into move. How that wave, that spiral, then waves through our whole body into the most distal, the most furthest point, which would be the hands. So let me try and show this way as best I can. So when we start producing these wonderful kind of lower limb reaction forces, the idea of that kind of medial, lateral, side to side, forward and backwards, rotational up and down forces through downswing. These forces we produce, they then, again, the idea of the spiral, wave through our body, have to go through lower limb, up through pelvis, through the spine, through that trail shoulder, along the arm, for the hands then to apply force onto the handle. Really what allows and what controls how well those ground reaction forces are applied to the club is the connection between that trail shoulder and rib cage. It's quite common, younger players again, have got ridiculously good ground reaction force data, but not necessarily high club head speed. So for that is strong caffeine. I'd make a very bad kind of rock star, but for different reasons. I'd be a bit kind of like that on stage now. So apologies for this. You might have observed this in people that work with, say, ground reaction data or force plates. They've got really good values, but their club speed's a bit, maybe not quite comparable. Give you an example. Usain Bolt has, to my knowledge, some of the lowest ever recorded ground reaction force data. He's still pretty good. Cameron Champ has some of the lowest ever recorded ground reaction data on the PGA Tour. He's still probably the longest champ. I know Bryson's done what Bryson's done, but from a pure movement observation, Champ is probably accepted the best at distance, but very low ground reaction data, because it comes down to how well they use that helix, that spiral. What's quite common in some players is they've got these great kind of ground reaction force data, but because of that trail shoulder disconnection, that wave goes through their body and then goes kind of gets absorbed because they've lost that connecting link. So they produce these wonderful values and then go, and it goes into the shoulder, the disconnection, and it kind of gets absorbed and lost. So they have proportionately low club speed to the ground force. Is everyone kind of happy with that kind of? So what links the feet to the club in some ways? is that trail shoulder.
So most of the players actually, most of the Finnish players that we've looked at, the best players, test the poorest.
Yeah.
In a lot, like
Yeah.
any of the testing we do,
Yeah.
tend to be the poorest.
I mean, you see so right.
The
I mean,
best players.
you then look at kind of what you test and how you test and what you test for, and where some of these tests have kind of originated from. That's global observation, I think, anyway. And it goes back to what I said at the start. We've lost that meaningful intellect in golf. Some people are just good. I got asked this years ago at a presentation I gave, and someone goes, "What's your observations of the best players?" I said, "Well, I thought about this. Some guys are just good, and others less so." The reality is some guys are just good at what they do despite the information, and some people aren't that great despite good information. It's just people. Some people are just good at golf, and others, bless them, aren't. They're kind of highly motivated underachievers, those people. Desperately want to be good at golf, but just not really that great. And that's the reality of what kind of UC so rightly said there. So going back to that right shoulder, when this moves well, you're in a core place in life. The references that I use would be around about that point in time, the hand path and the club kind of goes through the right shoulder. So call it what you want to call it. So hopefully you can all see pretty close together. How hand and club would kind of sit through that right shoulder joint. Then we start in real poor connection. So a really good first reference of that trail shoulder ribcage movement well will be kind of hand and club pass through that kind of trail shoulder. And then you can start to see some pretty kind of good threads there. We kind of move them further on. The elbows are pretty level. We don't start to see this stuff, which is that disconnection again. Even if I move this guy in a few extra frames, even then still the hands and shaft are still tracking through that right shoulder. That kind of lead arm, kind of both arms are kind of matched with the shape of the rib cage. Trail arm to the shoulder joints, trail up, lead arm to the shoulder joints, trail arm to the rib cage. Just the most wonderful control. Now this is, again, this is not coaching values. This is not saying you have to do this because that's golf coaching. That's a very, very different discussion. This is just good movement. It's just good movement around how can that trail shoulder ribcage move to produce, the most wonderful explosive movement of pain avoidance, because that's all you have to try and do is avoid it. Adaptable, sustainability, all these great things we look at in place. It's a great example. Just another player. There's a theme that when I recorded these, I like warm countries. Another good example of a guy who does it beautifully well. Oops. Pretty much the same, almost the same reference. The arms relative to the rib cage, the hands and shafts through the trail shoulder. I mean, just a wonderful, wonderful. And both these guys, I should know the answer to this. No, the first one definitely is. But approach one high 180 ball speed, but in the most wonderfully kind of controlled, sustainable way. They do it because they just move well. So some references we can use again: hand and shaft through the shoulder, that kind of lead arm to shoulder joints, trail arm to rib cage, and elbows pretty level. When we start to kind of, this is where cameras become a little bit kind of, when you're fortunate with Henk and obviously using the system here, we can kind of make it look good on camera, but it's kind of how we produce that. And a lot of it comes back to years of looking in mirrors and looking at the club and getting the club in a good position. There's no consideration given by some to actually how they produce the movement and actually what's their contribution to the club moving that way. So from a real pure anatomy.
Yeah, so it's more movement versus position. So
Yeah, absolutely right, and absolutely right. And again, it's how would I describe coaching? It really is that. It's so many conflicts you have to deal with. How they see the planet, their belief systems, their values, their history, where they've come from, their influences, things we spoke about late back in November for those guys that can remember. Anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, all these areas. which is why, you know, when you get someone it does very well, it just happens to align all those planets, which is why it's so hard to you know, how many guys really become good? Those internal drivers, those motivations to win. I know players who don't like winning, believe it or not. I know one in particular who doesn't enjoy winning events because of the pressures it creates for them. They like finishing third. So they get lots of cash with no stress. So I know a player, a very famous guy back in England, doesn't like winning tournaments. He's just happy just to kind of do his thing, get left alone and win plenty of money. How do you help that guy? He just doesn't want to win. He doesn't want the perceived stress that comes with it.
Make him good enough so he has the tools to win, and then allow him to fuck up at the
Yeah,
last hole.
yeah. Exactly. Make sure they do it though, not us, but you don't see it right. Any observations around that trail shoulder? We'll do some stuff around this later on. So we got onto the lead hip now. Again, that right shoulder lead hip, they're very much connected because of the X, the human anatomy. So one of my kind of favourite references around that kind of lead hip would be pretty much at impact. How much as that pelvis starts to glide that way, again allowing for the shape of the human, excuse me, allowing for the shape of that human, that how that lead hip likes to elevate and move up through impact, and how much that pelvis is for certainly for camera, for Henk there, how much the belt buckle was actually elevating and moving up as it rotates. So around about at impact, crudely, how that lead hip, lead knee, lead ankle would be pretty much in alignment. Now there'll be variations of that based on the shape of the human, but again, is a pretty kind of guide reference to work towards, again for Henk, for Cam in particular, how much that lead hip, lead knee, lead ankle would be kind of aligned. You think of any kind of jump and movement, typically you wouldn't kind of jump in these positions, well you could do, but it would create different kind of issues. So really how well aligned we are. One of the big observations that UC and I saw last month is how many people were kind of, but again that lead hip connects into that trail shoulder. Lead hip's also what I call the true GPS within movements, the lead hip. Now most established players are very aware through downswing of how or where that lead hip is in space relative to some of the less advanced players. Going back to your question around club delivery, that a lot of club delivery also connects back to where that lead hip is. So in some ways the pelvis controls the path of the club. It's a very kind of crude reference. How the pelvis moves is really responsible in many ways for the club path. There's a lot of very strong, real robust correlations to how the pelvis moves influences the path the club moves on. Another good one here. So these three videos were done in Houston. This one I actually went on the golf course for this guy. It's great to be on the golf course at Melbourne and London in January. Hence he's wearing a bobble hat. So there's a theme there. That two hot places in London in January. It's a little chilly with this guy. And this is back at my place. And again, just on this one, another great example. You can actually see how well that lead hip wants to elevate and move up, which is really representative of how well they can actually push downwards. So just kind of watch if I take this guy to the top of the backswing and stop. And these are all well on tour, these guys. In fact, all three are well on tour, so they're all kind of pretty successful tour players. So they're all kind of established players. So we kind of pause them at the top, keep going. Stay there, right, let's do it this way. So it happens to be his hips around about on that part of the wood. Is everyone kind of happy? It's a pretty reference. But how much in transition you can see how that lead hip wants to elevate, but without losing connection through that left foot. that beautiful movement of that pelvis upwards without all the adaptations around that foot and ankle. Little fun one for you to all do. You've been sat down way too long. Everyone stand up for me. We're doing this afternoon on the range. Everyone kind of just lift your toes off the floor for me. So kind of pick your toes up. If you've got space, jump as high as you can for me. Get your toes off the floor. Now pop your toes down again. Try and jump again for me. Much higher, much easier. Toes, big toes, quite important. So the minute that big toe, sit down on it, thank you. The minute we lose that big toe connection, good luck trying to move upwards. We'll talk about why more later on this afternoon, so I know we've got a bit to get through today. But that big toe is pretty influential on how we move the pelvis. So don't hurt your big toe, it's the short one around that. So some nice examples for you of kind of how the pelvis can move, references, lead hip, elevated, ankle, knee, hip and alignment, the trail shoulder references. But I'm going to give all this to you guys by UC and Hank anyway, so you can have these to play with. What I want to go into now is some actual data that UC and I collected back in July. Sorry, let's get it away, apologies. Some data, some live data that UC and I saw back in July of a real, such a powerful thread use, isn't it? We had most of these guys to the point where it's like, this could be, hence this trip, you know, because they're just at that place in life of around the kind of values and data that we were observing. I'm just going to drop out this 1 second and go to. I want to give you some examples first. Of still one of the kind of better movers. So initially, let's look at that kind of lead hip. So can you see that value here? Oops. Really what that represents is essentially how well they push downwards, is the short answer. So the more you push down, the quicker the pelvis gets pushed upwards, hence the idea of the big toe, that when you've got good toe connection, you can really spring up, expand again, pretty elastically into impact. So that value there where it says where the cursor is, so again for those who maybe didn't quite see that first time, such an important value because it represents how well, in essence, they're able to really extend, compress, push into that kind of lead foot, elevate that lead hip through impact. It's unusual to see, it's unusual to see really advanced movers not start with a 3 and upwards, so 30 something upwards. It's a bit like saying, what do most guys on the men's PGA Tour produce club speed with a driver? It's unusual to find someone less than 170. Typically, that's kind of almost that threshold. And or it's unusual to find someone say, take more than 30 putts. There's these kind of little numbers we have. What was very evident with a lot of the guys that we saw UC and I last month, which one was it?
So Mark, that was 42.5 centimeters per second going up, right?
Yeah.
Does tempo affect on that at all?
Always, yeah. What we saw with many of the guys last time were values very low. I mean, to answer your question, yes. So it's the rate, how quickly it moves. So when we're going very it's kind of harder to come up quicker. So that again, hence words you're going back for those that were here back in November. Hence I use that word so frequently, the elasticity in movement. That wonderful kind of springy kind of which is what we were designed to be. We got very plastic through life because we're all kind of like this these days, massively. So that wonderful kind of explosive, elastic, springy, that expansion, compression again. How well can you really expand it up through impact? So important.
Yeah, the highest value we had was low 30s.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at them, and most of the guys were kind of really. So again, what does that reveal, and how can we use that as a nation and as a group? We've really got to improve how they move around that lead hip. And that running goes into some of the training again, with Mate in particular. And who was the other chap? I keep forgetting his name. Are they both Mate?
Yeah.
That gets confusing.
Just make it easier for you. Just say Mate.
Took me about a year to learn his name, so yeah. So Mate is great, but I really enjoyed also the other guy, the slightly, don't know who's the oldest of the two, it doesn't matter really. But I really thought was good. You start looking then more at the physiology, recovery rates, the nervous system kind of side of it. But it was quite evident that how down they are around that is a group. Around that, how well they're good around that lead hip. So as a training, if this was now more around the trainers, okay, we've got to really prioritise that lead hip control, their ability to really extend and rotate and expand around that lead hip, because they were so low as a nation, as a group, sorry, I must say, as a group around that area. Reoccurring thing.
Was it more, if you looked at the physical test result, it's more of a kind of a movement problem, it's not like a strength or power producement problem, or could you see a correlation between those two physical tests and how they move?
He's right, some guys can actually test some but still produce low values.
Yeah.
And Yusi's also right, some guys don't test very well but still produce good values, because again, that's what overlaps back to how the brain perceives movement. I know some guys that they test poorly because they're just not very good at testing, but they're very good at moving. So it really questions, and this is perhaps where it was really misunderstood while I was last week when I was overseas. I said about squats and deadlifts are brilliant, so valuable, but it must connect back to what problem are we attempting to resolve today? How will squats and deadlifts resolve this? And they obviously chose to say it as squats and deadlifts. Mark said was not true. It's not true. But that's where a lot of kind of single leg stuff becomes more important. How well can you actually elevate around that lead hip? But then you'd argue to get to single leg, you must be on two legs. So it becomes that kind of discussion. So massively that we can really refine now. And I know UC and I spoke about this so much. The training we look at to really encourage good control, prioritise that lead hip ability. So it'll be interesting when we look at this later, obviously, as a group again. What kind of values our little test subject would like to kind of use. So, real common one we observed last time, and it all goes back, that's very incorrect in mine. Much of it connects back to, again, those three areas, the compression around that right side, how it really then constrains the idea to rotate, expand and compress. It's very hard to expand when we're compressed already, so we find ways of moving around that. It's very hard to compress welding down when we're already compressed, so it's a bit kind of becomes more that fixed movement. That trail shoulder lead hip, that wonderful X is becoming so. I'm actually annoyed at myself because I've moved away from this for a few years because you get distracted by new things. I'm really annoyed at my own self for being pulled away from these areas, but I'm pleased I've been reminded again. I've got to keep coming back to this because it's so important. That then we know from pretty robust research that the very powerful guys, the players, the ladies and the boys that produce the most club head speed and really powerful players, this value here at impact, or these values, so I'll explain this in a second, are so important. So what those little values there represent is really how well or how much force is moving up the club through impact. How much force is moving up the shaft as they come into impact. Essentially, how hard do they pull the club up as they move into impact. How hard they pull the club up in many ways then connects back to things like rotation, pelvis, lead hip elevation, compression, all these wonderful things we aspire to have. In many ways they all connect back to how hard, how well, how much force goes up the shaft. So everyone stands up again. We'll do this a lot this afternoon. I mean, take this as what it really is. It's a bit of fun. It's a group discussion, so we can't make it individually. So kind of, if you get it, great. If you don't stress. Just kind of almost make a little swing to impact. Deliberately kind of avoid the hands really pulling hard up through impact. Just kind of let the hands swing down in a pretty kind of unresponsive way. Just in a playful way now, again, any small movements. Just start to allow the hand to almost kind of pull up as you lead that left hip upwards. And I'm hopeful what you may start to experience are things like more rotation, more compression in that lead foot, more slightly kind of, a little bit more kind of expansive movement. So how hard you pull the hands up, how much force goes up the shaft, can very much connect back to one's ability to rotate, compress, that kind of stuff. Thank you, by the way. So these are not unexpected values, and it really goes back to, again, this is great for UC in particular. When we look at how do we know if what we're doing is helping? Another question we can look at. How do we know as a nation, with the national guys in particular, how do we know what we're doing through that phase of time has actually helped this player? Now, some things are very hard to actually tangibly reference. Some of my best sessions, I had actually a session, I hope it's a good session, with a player, I remember it well, it was back in May, European Tour player, we actually sat in his car for 2 hours, had a chat, and so much stuff, life came out. He actually didn't go to my studio that day because there was no point, because he opened up to me about some stuff at home, which is explaining why I had foot pain and performance issues. So you learn with these guys often that when golf is good, life is in a nice place. And when there's a distraction at home, golf is poor. But yet the guys on TV like to look at their golf swings always and think, so you look at it in life that not all movement problems are movement problems. Most things display as a movement problem, but they're not always movement problems. This guy had some issues at home, pretty poor ones unfortunately, so his foot started to get sore because of stress, and stress migrates into those poor areas. His performance was off because he was distracted. But the guys on Instagram, oh, you can play golf doing this, well, you won major champions doing that, so it's a big one for me. Not all movement problems are always movement problems. Life, movement, the movements you make are representative of life in many ways. But it's unusual to find someone not produce these values. So what we can use for UC in particular is how do we actually know if what we've done the last 6 months has helped? Purely from a movement observation, we can start to look at those values. It's unusual to find real good ones. The real good ones produce values kind of high 300s into the 400s. What do we observe mostly when we look at the kind of club forces and the guys last month were much more that how low they were, but really that wonderful compression, the expansion through that lead hip, the compression through the lead foot, one goes down, one goes up, how well they really kind of pull up through that hand, which connects back to that right shoulder. Why, when you look at individual forces of the hands, so for those that want to the kinetics, the forces and the torques, or rotational forces, look at the individual contribution of the hands. The right hand or right wrist is a much higher contributor to the total force in the lead wrist. If you look at the individual, we look at the hand forces because we see them as a hand. You look at the individual contribution, the trail hand, trail wrist, provides much more force to the club or torque to the club than the lead hand. What controls how the lead wrist applies force is that right shoulder connection. You don't see many fighters punch like this, do you? For a reason. There's a reason why. Look at all good fighters and certainly martial artists. All that trail shoulder connection, boxers, you don't see many boxers hit you with a wrist in this position. It's almost that most human innate position is to pop your wrist here, because the line of force goes all through the wrist into the hand. Then you try punching people in these positions, then you'd have a very short career. So where this stuff's come from in golf, who knows? But that's not my question to try and answer. So we know how that wrist, the trail wrist, is a much bigger contributor to the torque around the club. What controls the trail wrist? The scapula, how well it interacts again. Another very revealing one here whilst we're on this page, which we saw a lot, you see, in I last month. That little value here, when it says 0.0, so that's really the force along the target line of the handle. So how much force is moving, assuming, is moving along that target line that impact. I think we saw so many guys that were kind of 0, very low, negative in some cases.
Mostly negative, actually.
Yeah.
Particularly females.
A lot of young ladies, again, that's more just because boys and girls kind of have different imbalances. So for the ladies in the room, boys are messed up. I can assure you that they are just a mess. Girls just have their challenges, boys have theirs. It's just, you know, the acceptance of genders do things or move differently. Look at the real good ones again at impact. How well that the handle is still moving, or the force is still moving that way through impact. How much the hand is still moving that way as they come into impact. What does that value represent from a movement observation from this kind of 0.0? In essence, how much of this we see? Again, reduced connections to that trail shoulder. Again, we'll go through those references much later this afternoon, which is why we had so many of the young girls in particular with some sort of wrist issues and taped up, and my coach says you need surgery. When they say that, put that on camera and you just go, oh, no, you don't need surgery. It's terrible. When they're moving that way, poor control, club delivery again shallow and lacking real kind of distance, and yeah, that kind of stuff. That's why it's a nice question. So things we can look at. Another big one for me, again, looking at what we can see with some of the good ones again. See the little value here, and then that one, hopefully you can always see that. That kind of says -11, -18. Another big thing we're going to look at, but again, how do we know as a nation that we're helping? Or has the cure become the disease in some ways? Another way of looking at things. That, am I the problem? I'm sure I am. So is it me which is the issue? I'm always looking at, let's make sure I'm not the disease in this case. Those values that you look at real established players again, we're just going to go back to the player previously. We go to their impact position, you can hopefully see here those values. I'll move out the way so you can see them all. How beautifully matched they are at impact. Both about -9, doesn't look as much about the actual number. What does that mean to you again? It means those values represent the forces, the torques, rotating the wrist, the club as it would be in this case. And in essence, the wrist this way. So for those that are more into the kind of the kinetics again, the X value is this movement. Radial ulnar deviation. The Y is flexion extension. So as those wrists approach impact, when you have those wonderfully matched values, it's then equal contribution. A very proportionate match between how much force is going that way to that way. So are those wrists going through kind of fairly proportionate ranges without any real dominant directions? So the guys that are all being well, fingers crossed, good wrist health, good kind of upper limb, neck, elbow, shoulder health, typically the forces around that wrist into impact are fairly well aligned. So there's no real dominance there. The load is spread equally across the joint. We saw this so much UCI last month. That, whoops, you can hopefully see again, 18 and 11. So many of the players we saw, and it was predominantly ladies because of the group last time, so much more force this way, hence the handle slows down. They're very active in extension, flexion of the wrist, which is why we get so many issues around things like soft tissue, the muscles and bones around those wrists, because again, it's those force profiles which I know is not particularly cool because it doesn't sell on Instagram. A lot of it just goes back to they stand like that. So they found a way of moving around those problems. But that's not particularly attractive to kind of put on Instagram. It's like delete. I want to talk about all the cool stuff because it's just where humans are at these days. They want immediate, instantaneous validation. Anyway, so much of that stuff we saw last week for Henk in particular as well, around with your system, which you had this by the way, e-values, how max you are through impact, so we can even maybe look at that if someone is comfortable being a live subject after lunch around those areas. So just some things we can look at through the data, which is why I think it was so valuable for the last month, that we can now hopefully then start to look at it the other way. How do we really improve club delivery, distance performance, pain avoidance, all these great things? It just happened to kind of thread back to 3 pretty evident connected imbalances. We can get everybody through Finland in particular, getting better through here, which is what we'll do some work on later on with some practicals. We can really start to improve the control. Oh, I've got one more thing to show you actually, which I was trying to say. Around that kind of trail shoulder, references we can use, such as the ones we went through, and avoid some of this stuff. Now there's always exceptions, which is fine. It's funny with exceptions, golf's the only game that I know that actually copies exceptions. We're messed up with golf, I don't know why. You look at any other sport, doesn't matter what it is, the exceptions are kind of left. No one copies Usain Bolt's running style, but he's the best runner that we've known to date. But people like in golf, if there's an exception, they must be right, which is why every time someone wins a major championship, how they moves all over Instagram for the next month that they're right. But that's the same movement that made them miss 20 cuts. So golf is mad that it copies these exceptions. There's always exceptions, which is what makes it fun. So almost every other sport looks at what the real majority of great performers do. Gymnastics, martial arts, good sports like that. Golf looks at someone that wins an event. See, I told you they were right. So there's always exceptions to anything, but they're unusual. They're exceptions for many reasons. They're exceptional. And but you look at the real good ones over huge samples, it's unusual to find something not do this stuff. So good trail shoulder control, and equally so then, just how they move around that lead hip. If we can get all players to standing better through here, Henk, better control through here, better control through here, I think we'll be in a pretty good place, or certainly a much better place, I think, as a collective group. One of the values, which is, again, became almost then the response in some ways to let me just load one swing. Oh. One second. So hopefully you've all got good eyesight today. Look, I want you just to direct your eyes towards that little value there. So I'll explain that value in a second. So as the kind of club is moving downwards, that value will reduce. So you'll see it's kind of coming downwards. I'll explain what it is in a second, don't worry. What's vital is a representation, I think, of how well that trail shoulder left hip move is when that value first becomes a negative number, a minus number. In almost all really advanced, very accomplished players, okay, this person is good. Is typically when the shaft is parallel or horizontal downswing, when it first becomes minus, almost literally there to the frame. crudely, what that really represents is, in essence, at what point do they, let's call it release the club, because it's getting towards the end of the morning session now, is at what point do they actively start to release the club, is the short definition. It's very unusual to find someone, which we'll look at today, a good one, that would produce a negative value sooner, which often connects back to then poor control, what is it you're looking at? And almost, I think, for the exception of maybe a couple of use just because of the way it was, just the way it was last time. You're clean enough for it. With almost, the exception of probably how many, maybe even one or two. Look at all the guys we saw last time. Almost how early that became a negative number in transition, which really represented how, you can all see, how soon, how actively early in transition, because of this. Their GPS, the best navigational system we have, which we spoke about obviously at length back in November. How do I get here from here when that's there and that kind of works, which is why so much of the launch monitor data you see is more representative of, and this is what is interesting actually when we look at, we're very lucky now, kind of what we have, which gets good fun now. There's my friend at the back. Can I show your data? Do you mind?
Go ahead.
Tiger's kind of beneath you, so he said no, but I thought I'd get a good one. So,
Go ahead.
what we're very lucky to have now. We actually did. We did. Come on, computer. It's having to work hard today. Here's a blind test for you. We'll just do it this way. Yeah. What we now have. Come on, computer, chugging away. Right, here we go. What we're very lucky to have now, which is things with launch monitors in particular, they give you point data. But at that point in time, the club was, well, I know they calculate it, the estimates are over a few frames. What it doesn't tell you is kind of how the club got there and where it went next. So what we're very fortunate to have now is the club data actually in real time. Just as the player moves through swing, we can actually now see how the club is moving through swing. So it's interesting, we did some blind testing with the guys last time to start looking at things such as, so I actually named these files. These are the corresponding kind of TrackMan data that we had. How almost matched to like probably half a degree, just using TrackMan's example, things like the attack angle, path, the club face, the rate of rotation, so how that club is actually rotating at what rate at various phases in swing. So rather than just saying rotation rate is what it impacts, but yeah, what phase in swing did it start to adapt? Did they adapt quite late? Did they adapt quite soon? Is it quite more of a kind of a smoother kind of approach into impact? So we're very lucky now we can start to see how all these values are now interacting with the club and vice versa. How is the human adapting to how the club moves? So to have that, I think just tells a bigger story now. The forces, the movement, the club, pretty much on one capture is pretty cool. Look at the kind of accuracy we can now get around impact with this. Can't be wrong time ahead. That's staggering for me to literally the second. What we'll do after lunch, and if someone would be like to just, all you have to do is hit 5 balls for me, connect it up to the system, then we can maybe start to just explore what we've discussed this morning with some live data rather than obviously my kind of case study data, and then go through a lot of kind of practical examples we can use of if it's just you at your facility, it's just kind of, you know, we have what we have thankfully. How can you start to play with this, references, drills, for example, to really improve in some of these areas we've discussed this morning. So before we break, I know that's a big area compressed into 2 hours. What questions or observations do you have around anything you'd like me to expand on something, go through again? Any questions around that this morning? I can make most audiences go silent, don't worry, so it's not an unusual experience. Yes, sir.
Basically, the point of release when the value goes onto negative. How do you see club face control and therefore bolt flight control relative to release point
Massive,
the downswing?
Massive.
So,
I mean, look at it, certainly with more advanced players, I mean, probably the most realistic way of improving how a very established player moves is change their awareness of where the club face is, especially top of backswing. So very, very good movers are inherently aware where the club face is in swing. Less so with less established players because they're just not at that stage yet. They just haven't got to that stage. But very, very, you see it a lot back home in England in particular when we're going, say, from links golf to, say, inland course. The players really adapt their movements. They're aware of where the club face is based on their perception of the shot they're trying to play. So one of the more realistic ways of improving how someone moves is change their club face orientation, rotation at the top. You almost then, always invariably then, move differently based on how they perceive the club face. So I mean, massively, massively important. Less established players just haven't quite yet got the awareness of club face because, like you said, they're just at that stage in their development. But yeah, players are, or you could argue, probably rightly in many ways, everything we've discussed today with the guys at UC and I have seen because they know how do I get here from there. So all the adjustments they make or the adaptations they make go back to they just know I need to get here from here based on how I perceive the flight. So massively. So there's something very big within movement science called error for learning, that how you actually put the error in and allow the human to then resolve it based on their perception of the error. We can even play with this later. It's a great way of improving how you move. Purposely give you the error, and that this actually comes from pharmaceuticals, ironically, with obviously the COVID situation. It comes from how they develop things like vaccinations and medication. They give someone the flu to see how the medication works. So that philosophy actually comes in pharmaceuticals, so it's called error for learning within movement. So we'll do some of that later on. We'll give you all the error and see how you adapt all the values because you know where the club face is. So it's so important. So important. So important. We all good?
Yeah.
And thank you so much. And I'll let you tell where we're going to reconvene.